Hey guys, this is for the juniors. This is APUS. Today we're going to continue talking about how U.S. society mobilized to get ready for the First World War. Remember, this is a humongous undertaking, right? To actually get our society ready for something like this, our first European war, and basically all of U.S. society was basically transformed in order to get ready for that. So we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video. Government expanded beyond anything that Americans had been used to in the past, and government largely used propaganda and voluntary compliance in order to try to get people behind the war effort, but it often resorted to force as well. For example, the government actually took over the railroads completely during the First World War, rather than have to deal with private companies or any problems. So the government just took over the railroads completely. Now, there was this really big concern that the government would not be able to coordinate effectively to win. And what I mean by coordinate, would it be able to, direct private industry to do things that it needed to do, or the government felt they needed to do in order to win the war? For example, like producing materials that we need for the war, is private industry going to be able to do that, or will they need the government to coerce them? Now, an important agency was set up during the First World War, called the War Industries Board. Now, this was set up to coordinate government and business response to the war. They allocated raw materials, they established production priorities, things like that. It was led by Bernard Baruch, who is one of the most important financiers of the era. Baruch College is named after him. So the War Industries Board was basically set up to kind of coordinate, the government and private industry response to the war. Now, mobilizing the workforce. How do you get everybody, all workers, ready, and able to fight the war? Now, for one, unemployed men were threatened with being drafted if they didn't get jobs, and we're going to talk about the draft in a few minutes. So basically, you can't just like be laying around. Like, if you don't get a job, presumably a job that will help the country with the war effort, then you could be forced to be in the military and forced to go to war. A national war labor board was set up to try to coordinate government and workers. So the War Industries Board was set up to coordinate government and business response to the war. The War Labor Board was set up to coordinate government and labor and the worker response to the war. It was chaired by former President Taft, and the War Labor Board mediated disputes between workers and businesses because the government didn't want to have to deal with strikes during the war. And the War Labor Board actually won some very important concessions for workers. For instance, they got an 8-hour day for workers, and then once the war was over, that kind of stuck. So that's a huge goal, right? That was the goal of the labor rights movement, the worker rights movement, for decades. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours to do as you please. And that had been a pipe dream for decades, especially during the Gilded Age, when people were working 10, 12 plus hours. So winning an 8-hour day was a really important concession. It had been something that organized labor had been fighting for forever. They increased pay for workers. Wages went up 20% during the First World War. As a result, the nation's biggest union, the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, actually supported the First World War and U.S. involvement in the First World War. The AFL was always a more moderate union anyway, but I think a big part of the reason they supported the war effort was, so they didn't look unpatriotic, but also because they were winning really important concessions from the government that benefited workers. So the War Industries Board set up to try to coordinate business response to the war. The War Labor Board set up to coordinate worker response to the war. Now, there were some radical unions that did not support the war. Remember, unions tend to be on the left politically anyway, but probably the most prominent union that opposed the First World War was a union called the IWW, or the Wobblies. They were a radical left union that operated largely out of the West Coast. They wound up being accused of sabotage and terrorist activity. And that's a little debatable whether they actually went that far. Some people say yes, some people say a lot of things that were happening were just like pinned on them. But the IWW, the most prominent union to oppose the First World War, and the government went after them big time. In fact, the IWW pretty much dissolved by the end of the First World War. And a lot of that was because the government cracked down on them so harshly because they had opposed the war. Some radicals actually said working conditions aren't getting any better, as a result of the war, contrary to what the government was saying. Now, even though that there was an appeal to patriotism to try to say put your own problems aside to focus on winning the war, there were actually over 6,000 strikes during the First World War, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it. Striking, though, became a much bigger problem after the war was over, because a lot of workers resisted striking during the war, and once it was over, they wanted to make sure they were going to be treated fairly. So there were a ton of strikes. There were strikes during the war, 6,000, but there were a lot more after the war was over, and in some very important industries too. That was a big reason why, one reason why the United States kind of swung to the right politically after the First World War. Many reasons they did that, but one of the reasons was because there was a real feeling that organized labor, that unions had become too radical. America always is, and we talked about this like last semester. America historically is resistant to unionization. Countries in Europe, it's par for the course for workers to organize. There's resistance there too, but in the United States, a lot of Americans, not just conservatives, a lot of Americans in general just don't trust unions because they feel that, the unions are too radical. They don't like the idea of workers banding together to fight for better conditions, because they say, well, that's not the American way. They argue the American way is rugged individualism, right? Fighting to improve conditions on your own, without relying on workers banding together to do it. They say, well, that's socialistic. So America is historically more resistant to unionization than other Western economies. When workers did go out on strike, bosses often very cynically, but shrewdly too, wanted to turn workers against each other, turn the poor against each other. And one of the familiar tactics to kind of turn the poor against each other is relying on ethnic and racial prejudice, right? To basically, say, well, workers banding together, but do you really want to band together with somebody who's Jewish or Catholic or somebody who's black? So employers, workers, forces of conservatism often use racial and ethnic prejudice to kind of divide workers. And one way they did that during the war is, and they not just during the war, but often, is that when workers went out on strike, they hired black workers to be strike breakers. And the thing is that exacerbated racial tensions, right? And because a lot of workers who went on strike, because they wanted better conditions, then saw themselves being replaced on the job, and they were being replaced on the job by black workers. So that didn't sit well with a lot of them. Now, despite labor problems that existed during the war, the economy boomed during the First World War. That usually is the case with full-scale war. The economy usually gets better because, the entire society is geared up to produce all the materials that we need to fight the war, and that puts most people to work. And it gives people more money to spend. So the thing is, the economy boomed during the First World War, and this was the case during the Civil War as well, and also during the Second World War in the 1940s. That's what actually ended the Great Depression. Now, farm production went up 35%. The civilian workforce grew, so more people were actually working. There was a rush of people to the cities because a lot of the jobs were actually in the cities. The urban population swelled, particularly with a lot of African Americans who moved from the South to northern cities. That's called the Great Migration, and we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail during our live class on Thursday. Agricultural prices doubled. Farmers began producing an enormous amount of goods because so much stuff needed to be sent over to Europe for the people, the hungry people of Europe, but also to America's soldiers. This turned into a gigantic problem after the war was over because a lot of farmers continued producing at war levels, and there wasn't as much demand for farm goods after the war was over. But the farmers kept producing and producing, and this led to huge drops in farm prices because of overproduction, which was a huge problem in the 1920s, and ultimately was one of the causes of the Great Depression. But the roots of it are in the First World War because they produced so much during the war, but there was less demand for all those farm goods after the war. So that was a really big problem getting into the 1920s. Now I want to talk about the ways that the government suppressed dissent. Now, dissent is when you criticize the government, right? And that's one of our most fundamental freedoms as Americans, right? Something that we take for granted, right? The idea that you have the right to protest against the government. You have the right to speak out against your government. You have the right to speak out against your leaders, right? That's a First Amendment guarantee, or at least we thought it was. Because during the First World War, the government began actively, I was going to say discouraging, but beyond that, actually banning people from speaking out against the war or speaking out against the government. So that was a huge change in American life. But the thinking was we have to focus on winning the war. We can't really tolerate people here and there, criticizing the government because that's going to undermine the war effort. That was their argument, but civil liberties are one of the things that, we pride ourselves on and one of the things we fight for, right? So the thing is that, when we're suppressing civil liberties in the name of defending civil liberties, it's all levels of ironic, right? Now, there was a lot of mob violence done by private people during the First World War. German Americans were often targeted for violence and abuse. Pacifist radicals, people who were opposed to the war effort, were targeted by mobs because they were seen as unpatriotic and they were, hurting the war effort. It was, they said President Wilson, who was the man who was kind of identified with the idea of, liberties, right? And rights that all people are entitled to just by the fact that you're a human being. Wilson, that's what he's known for, but Wilson actually said about people who criticize the war, "Woe to the man who stands in our way." So that's quite stunning language coming from the president, especially a president who's identified with defending human rights. Now, who were these people who were opponents of the war? Now, they ran the gamut. There were a lot of people who were. There were some German Americans who opposed the war for nationalistic reasons because, they didn't want the United States to be fighting, their old mother country. They still felt some ties to Germany, like my grandfather. I told you that in our live class, who was a 9-year-old, actually, a 9-year-old German American boy, actually supported vocally the German war effort in the First World War. Quakers opposed the war. Quakers, part of their religion is they're pacifists. Pacifists who weren't religious opposed the war because they felt that, all fighting is wrong. But probably the biggest group that opposed the war and those that were targeted the most by the government were socialists. Now, socialists in general have been historically targeted by the U.S. government because, a lot of people feel they're subversive, they're not loyal Americans, they have un-American ideas. So socialists have been targeted for a very long time, but they were particularly targeted during the First World War because socialists were probably the group that most vocally opposed the war effort. There was a lot of reasons why they did that, but probably the biggest was because that they were convinced that the war was just basically, an attempt to enrich business. That interpretation actually was accepted even by non-socialists after the war was over. Basically a belief that this was just a giant plot by banks and by manufacturers to get us involved in the war, so they can make more money by making more goods that they can sell to the government. So that was the main reason why socialists opposed the war so vocally. But socialists are also skeptical of U.S. government policy in general, and a lot of them just did not feel that there was any reason for the United States to be involved in the First World War. 65,000 men actually registered as conscientious objectors, or COs, during during World War One. That means that when you're drafted, we're going to talk about the draft in a minute. Instead of putting your name for the draft and saying you're eligible to fight if you're called up, you're saying that I object to the war and I will not fight. That actually takes a lot of courage to do something like that, because you're actually going on the record with the government as saying that you do not support the war effort. And a lot of people interpret that to mean you don't support the country, which isn't the same thing. But people sometimes think of it as the same thing. Bernie Sanders actually registered as a CO, as a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War in the 1960s. I'm always a little surprised that wasn't brought up more during his presidential campaigns, because there's one thing avoiding the draft, but it's a whole other thing to actually go to the government and actually register as a conscientious objector saying I'm against the war. It's braver though, but it's much riskier in a lot of ways. Now let's talk a little bit about the draft. Now, the draft is when men are forced to join the military, right? A draft had been implemented during the Civil War, if you remember from 10th grade, but it was very weakly enforced. A lot of people just never registered for the draft. Only 6% of well, it varied, but maybe between 6 and 10% of the Union Army were draftees. Most people who were in the Union Army during the Civil War were actually volunteers. But the draft was used because there was this concern that there weren't going to be enough men to actually fight. So the draft was implemented during the Civil War to mixed effect. You remember you could buy a substitute for $300. You could actually take your place in the draft, which a lot of rich people did. The Confederacy used the draft during the Civil War as well, even though most Confederate soldiers were volunteers as well. So that was the only experience the United States had with the draft. And that was 50 years earlier, and it was kind of hit or miss, and had a lot of holes in it. But the draft during the First World War was a full-scale draft. The Selective Service Act of 1917 required all men 21 to 30 to register for the draft, and later it was expanded to 21 to 35. To 45. Now, registering for the draft is not the same thing as being drafted. If you register for the draft, it just means you're putting your name in the system to be called up in case the government needs you to fight. 24 million men registered for the draft during the First World War, and of those 24 million men who registered, 3 million were ultimately drafted and sent to go fight in Europe. I'm actually going to show you when we have our live class. I actually found on Ancestry.com, which is an amazing site for history buffs like me and people who are into family history. Me too. I am as well. I found my great grandfather's draft card from the First World War, and he actually was a German citizen. And not an American citizen during the First World War, which is interesting. But even he, as a German citizen, was required to register for the draft. So 24 million men registered for the draft. 3 million men were actually drafted, but 3 million men just refused to register for the draft. They just didn't, for a variety of reasons. They might have been against the war. They might have not wanted to go to the war. They might have been scared. Whatever. There were a lot of reasons. Maybe they're making a statement. Well, they were making a statement by not registering, but it maybe varied what statement they actually were making. So 3 million men didn't even register. There was a major propaganda campaign to try to encourage American men to register for the draft. saying it was basically your patriotic duty to kind of put your name out there for the draft. Often the well-connected got draft exemptions. Unfortunately, that was the case quite often, right? In American history up until the Vietnam War, right? When a lot of people who are rich and well-connected managed to avoid being drafted. Now, two laws were passed during the second. This is very important, guys. Two laws were passed during the First World War that basically limited the rights of those who were opposed to the war. The first law that did that was the Espionage Act in 1917, which banned, this was the wording of the Espionage Act, prohibiting interference with military operations, promoting insubordination, or interfering with military recruitment. So basically, if you were telling people not to register for the draft, you were in violation of the Espionage Act. But it was also very broad, and they interfering with military operations or promoting insubordinations are very broad terms. And often the Espionage Act was used to just target anybody who was opposed to the war. The Espionage Act, by the way, is still on the books, and 100 years later, and it's still used to go after mainly leakers. People who leak government documents to newspapers. The Obama administration actually used the Espionage Act more than almost any other administration since Woodrow Wilson to go after leakers. They kind of had a very strong no tolerance policy toward people leaking information to the media. But the act that was even more extreme than the Espionage Act was the Sedition Act of 1918. Now, remember, sedition had been banned once before, back in 1798. Sedition is when you speak out against the government. And the Sedition Act outlawed, quote, saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive toward the government, the Constitution, the flag, or the military. So that is very, very broad, right? So basically, anybody who criticizes the United States government at all could find themselves in violation of the Sedition Act. And prominent socialists were swept up in this crusade, to go after people who spoke out against the war. Probably the most famous example was Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was the legendary leader of the Socialist Party. He had been leader of the Socialist Party for decades, and he gave a speech against the war, and he was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for speaking out against the war. He was paroled 3 years, or the sentence was commuted 3 years into the 10-year sentence. But that is really something, right? He was already a man in his 70s, and he was very, very famous. And he was, had every right to speak out against the war as an American citizen. But this was a violation of the Sedition Act. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted because Jehovah's Witnesses don't want to do the Pledge of Allegiance. It's against their religion. Members of the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, were targeted because they had vocally opposed the war. The Masses newspaper, which was the socialist newspaper at the time, was actually banned during the First World War. It was not allowed to be sent through the mail. And one of the reasons why there was this huge fear of the left wingers during the war years wasn't just the fact that they opposed the war. It was also because the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, and that actually stirred a lot of hatred and anger and paranoia in the minds of a lot of Americans who were fearful of anybody who was on the left in the United States, worried that a revolution could potentially happen here. Now, the question I know a lot of you guys are asking is this constitutional? Does the government really have the right to ban basically speech if you're speaking out against the government? Is that, that's, I thought, protected by the First Amendment? Well, the Supreme Court, let me say this. Courts in general often give a lot of leeway to the government to do whatever it feels it needs to do during wartime. Inter arma legis dormis. In times of war, the law sleeps. That's unfortunately always been the case, where kind of like the government, the courts just basically say to the government, look, we're not going to interfere. Just do what you think you got to do to win the war. So a man named John Schenck had been arrested for encouraging Americans not to register for the draft, and he was arrested for that because that's a violation of the Espionage Act. And he appealed his conviction, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that the government did have the right to limit speech if the speech poses, in their words, a clear and present danger to others. So if what you're saying threatens other people, then you don't have the right to say it. Then your free speech is limited. The metaphor that the Supreme Court used was you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Now, you could argue, is speaking out against the war, really yelling fire in a crowded theater, is that, really interfering with anybody else's rights? Just if you're against, if you vocally are opposed to the war, that's the question. But the court said it does. And the government does have a right to limit free speech. And that's true to this day. Not in terms of like political speech or speaking against the war, or war or government policy. You're certainly allowed to do that. But there are limits on free speech, right? You can't threaten people. There are limits on certain types of pornography. There are limits. And basically, if it's interfering with somebody else's rights, then the courts say that the government has a right to limit it. So this was a very, very spotty record that Woodrow Wilson, the government, had during the First World War. I wouldn't even. I think that's an understatement. It was a very poor record regarding civil liberties, particularly when we're fighting this war in the name of protecting civil liberties. All right, guys, very good. So remember, you watch these videos from start to finish. I should have said that at the start instead of the finish, but hopefully you've watched this whole video. And I'll see you in our live class on Thursday, and we're going to talk then about how World War I affected profoundly the lives of African Americans. And then I'm going to actually show you a PowerPoint for some wartime propaganda posters from some of the stuff that we talked about in our last video. If I don't remember to do that, somebody remind me. All right, guys. See you on Thursday. All right. Peace.